Good afternoon, Mavis Jones and Diane Thomas.
Hello, how are you? Patty Newcomb.
And thank you for participating in the reception. We have your poster hanging, and it's very lovely. But just so that you won't have to stand by it for 2 hours, it was very kind of you to come and be interviewed about it. Your poster is called Caring at the Bedside. And this project has been going on for quite some time because you are at the specialty hospital, which is very small. And so your sample is accruing briskly, but for you that's slow because you have 10 beds. Nevertheless, it's a nice, strong study. It's been going on for a while, and I would reckon maybe another 6 to 8 months before we actually get the number of people we want. So we'd like to hear about where it is in process. I know you presented last year to tell us what you were going to do. Tell us, first of all, a little bit about how you got the idea to do this, and then we'll talk about what this is, what you're actually doing.
Okay. Last year, THR implemented the professional caring model, and it was based on Joanne Duffy's quality caring model. And when it first came out, I had the idea of asking the nurses what their perception of the caring they were delivering was. And we developed a little paper tool for them to jot down stories of how they were caring. And we saw that as a tool that we could use to compare to patients' perceptions by using the Duffy Cat-5 tool, which elicits patients' perceptions of caring.
Okay. So you have subjects then that are both patients and nurses?
Yes.
Okay. How did you go about organizing your project with this kind of double sample? You have a mixed method study, first of all. The nurses are giving you qualitative data in the form of stories, and then the patients are giving you quantitative data in the form of scores on your Cat-5. So you have two different ways of getting data. So how did you, in the very beginning, how did you organize all this?
She can speak to how we've implemented.
We consent the patients for the IRB and ask them if they'd be willing to take part in this study and explain the study to them. They sign a consent and they fill in at least 2 surveys, which is the same survey. They do it after they've signed their consent and agreed to be in the study, and they do it again prior to discharge to see if their opinions change over the course of their stay. We collect those surveys in and turn them in for comparison with the stories that the nurses have written about the same patient to see if they match up. And
the nurses also consent prior to starting their stories, though the stories are something we were going to do anyway at change of shift. So
what the nurses are really consenting to is to let us actually use their stories in the research. You're right, the stories were something that you guys were going to do anyway. How are you going to use those stories anyway if we had not done the research project?
I hope we can use them to share among the staff and help them to see what types of behaviors really do reflect different types of caring, and how that may or may not make a difference in terms of the patient's perception of caring.
Are you going to have nurses read their stories?
We may. That would be one way we could do it at unit-based council or staff meetings.
Okay. Mavis, I know you've been doing most of the consenting and administration of surveys in your hospital for this project. Can you tell us any observations you've had about administering the survey or the consents?
Well, of course, not all the patients are capable of taking part in the survey, and we only have 10 beds. And we may have 2 or 3 patients at all times, at least, that are either comatose or confused and just not capable of taking part in the survey. Of the others, initially I ran into a little resistance, and only a portion of them would agree, and some of them would say, oh, I don't want to take part in anything like that. But I've noticed recently, I don't know why, but more patients will say, oh yeah, I'll do that, I'll be involved in that. So I'm getting more consent in recent months than I did in the beginning.
Well, yeah. Possibly you feel more comfortable about it.
Maybe.
Going in there and asking about it. On your poster, you have some preliminary results. Can you all tell us a little bit about that? They are preliminary. This probably will change over time, but what do we know right now?
Well, right now, 14 patients have completed the survey at least once, 9 of them once at admission time, and then the second time at discharge, as Mavis described. What we've seen so far is that there is a statistically significant difference between the initial survey results and the latter survey results. And it's indicating that patients' perception of caring improves with time.
And your hospital is different than the other hospitals because you are a long-term hospital. So more or less, how much time elapses between these two surveys?
Probably 3 weeks at least.
At least
3 to 4 weeks, sometimes a little more.
All right, so what you're seeing is that for your patients, over the course of 3 weeks, they perceive the emotional care that they're receiving in better terms.
Correct.
When they leave than when they begin, which may have, if this continues, if this trend continues, it may have implications for units where people only stay 1 or 2 days.
Absolutely.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, you know, as the model describes, quality health outcomes can be in relationship to the relationships that the patients make with nurses, and they have more opportunity to build a relationship with the nurses and have trust with them over time, which you're just not going to build the same relationships in a 2 or 3 or even 4-day hospital stay.
Right. Which you may see on patient satisfaction scores, actually. Right. Mm-hmm. In your hospital, you have intense contact with these patients,
mm-hmm.
don't you? Yeah, they see the same nurse over and over. Okay. We also learned a little bit about our tool. I think you are the first team that actually started using the Cat5. Now, our Safe Zone people also use that tool. And when they did, they had really good reliability. And you also had really good reliability even with just your 14 that you've done so far. The tool itself is behaving very well. And that was one of our reasons for using that tool. Since it's part of our professional practice model, we keep wanting to kind of test it out. And the good thing is that in the other project I just mentioned, they tested it also against another tool, and it performed very well. So it looks like that helps with its validity. So that's a nice thing to know. Tell us then where you're going to go with this. We know you're going to keep administering the surveys until we get to where we have a good sample size, and you'll keep on with your narratives with your nurses. And you had mentioned earlier they might be reading those. Mm-hmm. So what kinds of activities you think you can do when we finally do get the results from this? And what kind of activities can you do now with the narratives that you've got?
Well, I certainly think, you know, as we do the analysis, we'll be looking at how their stories fit into the caring factors that Duffy describes. And it will be interesting to find out if the nurses really perceive their stories as fitting into those categories the way we have analyzed them. So that would be one thing we can do. And hopefully, over time, just hearing and talking more about the caring factors and what the patients perceive as caring factors, the nurses can start to use some of that in their practice, maybe to help build those caring relationships either differently or more intensely, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I noticed that just when looking at your surveys that you've given me, it's revealing to look at every item in the survey and see how people answer it, and I think that might be helpful to the nurses. Telling their own stories for sure, but then looking at every single item, if you ever have time to do that, or maybe just taking a couple and actually looking at it in detail and saying, I wonder how my narrative matches with this item, since they've gone to a lot of trouble to operationalize their concepts in there.
I always find that interesting when I pick up the survey, knowing that usually I've taken care of that patient quite a number of times, and I find it interesting.
Are there any particular items you notice that seem to always score very high or very low?
I think we do very well on emotional support, I think.
Well, you absolutely do, because your scores are always high.
Yeah.
They're high even at the beginning, which is interesting,
Well, yes.
but by the end they're even higher.
Yeah.
But I wondered if there were any that stood out to you, that maybe there was a trend. This always runs a bit lower, this always runs a bit higher. Do you expect anything now?
I can't say. I've not studied them in that much detail.
Okay.
So I can't see any trends.
Well, that's probably a good thing. That's really what I'm supposed to be doing, not you. So that's a good answer. All right. Thank you very much for putting your poster in today. And I think that by this time next year, we will have complete results for this. And we'll have a very interesting story to tell of our own.
It'll be exciting because it really is good research to support the nursing model that we've implemented throughout THR.
I think it is too.